Hi, and welcome to TEDx Seattle Community Conversations. I'm your host, Phil Klein, and today I'm here with Sara Sanford, the founder of ThinkGen, the gender equity and inclusion organization that is responsible for developing the first certification for gender equity at workplaces in the United States. She is also a lecturer at the University of Washington. Sara, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Phil. I'm excited to be back with the TEDx family. This is fun.
Yes, well, your talk has now received over 1.5 million views, as I see. So it's thrilling to see that it's getting additional attention in the last 6 months, especially. So congratulations on that. And we really look forward to hearing from you about how the work has been going, what progress you've been seeing. Perhaps you could give us an update of how things have been going in your work in the last 10 or 18 months since you gave your talk.
Sure. Since giving the talk, I mean, it's been such a great tool to have. And, I'm going to go full disclosure, and no way did TEDx ask me to brag about the great experience that is TEDx. But I think for our organization, it's been great because our approach to equity and inclusion isn't something that really fits in a tweet. It's not a slogan. It treats equity and inclusion as being as complex and nuanced as it really is. And so getting the chance to give that talk and have it recorded and then share it with people has been this moment in which people say, oh, I get it. Oh, okay, I understand the difference when you talk about treating equity and inclusion like any other critical business function, and what it means to really focus on changing mechanics rather than mindsets. So we've been working with, a greater variety of organizations. And one of the things that I think we're seeing play out now in, the midst of this crisis that everyone is trying to cope with is that the organizations that we started working with 18 months ago or 12 months ago are really riding out this crisis better, compared to their competitors. A lot of them are saying that, the tools that they put in place because of Gen are allowing them to continue to be more inclusive even while everyone's working from home. And so I think part of that is that, if equity and inclusion have now been front of mind for a year, it was front of mind when they had to cope with this crisis and they had to really think of how is everyone still going to play as meaningful a role in the organization, that, that was kind of a habit and a practice they had built up by then. And then frankly, one of the things, that we work with organizations on is making remote work inclusive and how to make their flexible work policies really be accessible to everyone, because we tend to see stigmas in the workplace where certain groups are really encouraged to take time and other groups get stigmatized if they do. And so fortunately, a lot of these orgs really have policies in place now going into the pandemic where everyone can work at home and still be included. So that's been great to see.
And in the certification that you've been offering companies, what kinds of metrics still apply and are easy to continue to measure and manage, now that we're social distanced and many people are working remotely and from home?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the ones that have to do with remote work are obviously being emphasized a lot more. So, some of the things we talk with organizations about have to do with meetings and meeting behaviors, especially, when they used to take place in person. Our focus on equity and inclusion really is about driving organizations to harness, say, the collective intelligence of everyone in the room. So what we used to see is that companies would bring in diverse recruits and then they wouldn't truly be included. And one of the places that really used to happen was in meetings. So there was this common phenomenon of people either being interrupted or having their ideas stolen by other people, and then they're not getting credit for them. Or they just don't get a chance to comment. So one of the things that we found in our research is that men, and especially white men, are likely to respond the fastest when being asked a question in a meeting. So they're likely to raise their hands before the question is even finished or immediately after. Women and racial minorities tend to take longer and have a bit of a pause. That doesn't mean that they're, actually thinking any more slowly. It's usually that their input has been held to a higher standard, so they're considering more factors. So one of the things we recommend in organizations, if they truly want the input of everyone who works there and they want to harness the power of diverse insight, we tell them to institute a pause. So we say, ask that question and just make it a rule that nobody raises their hands for a minute or for 2 minutes, and then ask for feedback. So that's one of these tricks that we're recommending organizations really transfer to the remote environment, because everyone's having Zoom meetings now, and it's created a new kind of playing field to level, so we've been reaching out to a lot of orgs about how to make your Zoom meetings really intentionally inclusive and still make sure to get that feedback from everyone. And in some ways, I think for some people, it feels more inclusive. They can, write their feedback in the chat window. They have other ways now to really be included, but we're also seeing that, it can be harder to evaluate work. So we're also working with a lot of organizations on how to make their performance evaluations still mean something. Because I think now, we've realized this isn't going to be a week, this isn't going to be a month. This, unfortunately, is something that has lasted a long time. And so we're working with that. And then, honestly, for a lot of them, it's that they were in the midst of creating these really great DEI inclusion strategies, and then the pandemic came, and they had to pause, and they're kind of panicked, and they may have a different organization, that they go back to in 2021. And so we're really just helping them figure out, how do we keep DEI front of mind? How do we not let this go? How do we not give up on this?
Wow, so no shortage of opportunities for improvement. I would love to slow down and unpack some of what you shared. You described the importance of doing an assessment, at the beginning of working with an organization. And then there is change that is surfaced and that can be implemented through some of the specific recommendations that you suggested. And then there is what the progress of that actually looks like in the workplace, and then measuring that progress. So there's plenty of complexity in that. Can you walk us through a scenario where you start to see that change actually taking root and taking hold, and then generating results, if there are examples like that?
Yeah, yes. That's a great question. So our assessment, I think everyone has survey fatigue at this point, and I completely understand why. So our assessment does include this employee survey. We're proud to say we've gotten the average time to take it down to 14 minutes. But what that survey is designed to do is really reveal these gaps in experience between certain groups in the workplace. So it's not really a typical employee engagement survey. We're not asking these big nebulous questions like, do you think you work in a fair workplace? We ask questions like, has your manager asked you about your career development goals in the last 12 months? And so as an example, looking at our national data, because we keep the survey open on our website just to keep getting a baseline. When I look at that national data right now, as an answer to that question, 72% of men say yes and 44% of women. And so our employee survey is really full of questions like that are just asking if people, have been talked to by their senior manager, if they've been invited into professional development opportunities that are business related, things that are really objective and trackable. And those tend to be the moments that we bring to leadership, and that's their aha moment. So that's kind of the first place where we see change. We talk about we don't do trainings, and we don't, but in a lot of ways, the results of the data end up being their own training, in that they become this opportunity for leaders to look at this data and see in really tangible ways, okay, different groups have been having very different experiences in our organization. And that's, despite good intentions. That's despite the fact that leaders really wanted to center equity and inclusion. So we start with that. We do this employee survey. We do a processes audit, which sounds like such a scary word when we say audit. but it just means that we ask a point of contact what the written policies in an organization are. You know, so do you have paid leave policies? Do you have a nursing room? Do you have remote work? What does your recruiting strategy look like? And then we pause and, you know, we look at that data that comes back from employees. We look at that data that comes back from HR. And so, yes, we look for those gaps in experience, but we also look at gaps between those two stories. So sometimes, you know, an HR rep will tell us, yes, we have a paid leave policy, and then none of their employees are saying that. And so that tends to be this good moment in which, you know, it's not that we think HR is lying to us, but a lot of times, like, HR has put in all this work to build inclusive policies, and they just haven't been communicated out to the organization effectively. And that ends up being kind of another moment of change where the organization goes, oh, this is why people aren't happy. They actually don't know these things exist. They actually don't know that we've put this kind of effort in. And then, you know, the other part that really takes up, you know, most of our work in a great way is seeing that there are well-intended policies that unfortunately aren't evidence-backed, that haven't been implemented in the right way. And we look at those policies and we end up revamping them to counter the impact of bias. You know, we really end up optimizing them to counter the impact of bias. So as an example of what that looks like, panel interviews are a common example of this. They became very trendy in the DEI conversation. People thought, okay, if we have a panel that's interviewing a candidate and we have a woman or a person of color on that panel, then we've done our job. Then we have diverse insights being provided on who we should hire. What actually ends up happening, you know, we talk about the hippo effect, the highest paid person in the room, is that everyone on that panel, if they're together, will just default to the opinion of the highest paid or the dominant person in the group. So we really recommend to organizations, like, split up that panel, have each person on that panel separately interview the candidate with their own sets of questions. And then we help them, you know, standardize the rest of the interview evaluation process, because it's this area that is just so prone to our biases, whether or not we want to believe it, you know, in ways that have nothing to do even with gender or race, where we found that if people interview candidates in the afternoon, they're less likely to hire them than people that they interview in the morning. So it's something that really can be impacted by design at every level. And then, you know, we see these other changes that I think organizations may never hear the impact they have. The one that, you know, got to me is that we heard from an employee of an organization that we were certifying that ended up expanding their healthcare to cover dependents. That's one of our, you know, criteria in the certification. We look at their healthcare. And so the employee wrote to us and said that she was able to now leave an abusive relationship that she had been in because she was previously dependent on her partner's healthcare to cover their child together. And now she didn't have to be in that anymore because her employer was providing this, and so she could leave. So, you know, one of the really incredible things that we get to see is how the impact of these changes end up extending far beyond the office into people's everyday lives.
Yes, that is powerful. I mean, that has the transformational effect in individuals' lives. And, you know, thinking a little more on this question of unconscious bias, there is a way in which it sounds like you're seeing people feel like if they've done anything, then it's easy for them to think they've done everything, right? And that the problem is solved as soon as they've taken the first step. And it can be harder to kind of keep looking as you uncover either that bias or aim towards a new state, a changed state. And if you take a very specific problem, maybe like getting credit for their ideas, for women and people of color to more actively being given credit for the ideas they come up with in an organization. Can you see that kind of change happening and what it looks like when an organization fully and clearly gives credit where it's due?
Yeah, the word that comes to mind that other people have told me that, like, I don't get to be there and witness, but that other employees tell me, is that it's energizing. I think one of the coolest things about it is that it has this impact for everyone in the organization, that they end up having this return to innovation and this really energizing return to having new ideas being presented in the workplace, because you're finally hearing from people that have been there for years, but for a variety of reasons have had barriers that have prevented them from being heard. And so obviously, you know, I think for the underrepresented, or I often like to say it's an Arlen Hamilton phrase, I have to give her credit, the underestimated people in the workplace, it's just this relief, and it's something incredibly new to finally have your ideas heard. You know, I get asked a lot what the most common problems are that we see in the workplace for women and people of color. And, you know, usually that question is a bit leading, and there's a preamble that's like, oh, I bet you see some really terrible Me Too incidents. And I say, you know, sure, those happen. But what I see most frequently are these barriers to just being taken seriously. You know, if I could put kind of all these problems into one bucket, I think it would be not being taken seriously, and that actually ends up being the most pernicious. You know, where I've worked in the finance industry before. I was there for 5 years, and it was like both things happened. You know, I was sexually harassed in the finance industry, and I had situation after situation in which I was ignored. And I know that in many ways felt more harmful for me, to feel like I put in all this work and wasn't heard. And so I think for a lot of women and minorities, it's this moment where all of the work they've done up to that point is finally honored. And I think, you know, part of the change that happens is that we get these great stories of leaders reaching out to their employees and saying, you know, we got back this data. I'm sorry we haven't really acknowledged this in a real way up to this point. And leaders acknowledge we're at the starting line. And I think that is the most impressive thing that a company can do. I think that's the thing that ends up having the biggest impact. I understand why a lot of organizations hesitate to say, we have a problem. You know, the moment you say that, you're liable for fixing that problem, for doing something about it. But otherwise, employees just feel like year after year, they haven't been heard. They feel a little bit of that, am I nuts sense? And that moment in which, you know, their story is acknowledged tends to really shift the energy in organizations.
Sara, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it.